Hi guys, so a few things. Thank you so much for all your heartfelt best wishes about my health. I'm doing okay, you'll be pleased to hear. Also, I'm trying different editing softwares, so this video and maybe others might be different whilst I try out new things, but I might chop and change. Now on to the most important things. This is a shorter production, but with a strong warning, as this video is about the abuse and murder of a very, very young little girl. I've covered some horrors on this channel, but this is something else. Please click off it now if you'll find this triggering. I'll be using stock footage of babies, not often though, but this doesn't include images of the victim, but it's done to tell the story, but also to reinforce just how small and vulnerable she was, and the evil of the man who took her life. Anyway, on with the video. On Thursday the 8th of June 2023, a 36-year-old man called Hugo Ferreira committed a rape and murder in Welverdien, a small town in the Gauteng province of South Africa. This would be a heinous enough crime, but the victim was his own daughter Caithlyn, and she was just 8 days old. Caithlyn was distressed because she was hungry and had a dirty nappy, but instead of comforting her, Ferreira decided that he would give her, quote, something to cry about, before launching a brutal assault which robbed Caithlyn of a life that had barely begun. This man is one of the most evil I've covered on this channel, but this case will disgust and appall you. Welcome to Evil Among Us. There's not much information about Hugo Ferreira, but what I have found shows that he was a dangerous, self-entitled monster since he was a child. He was born in around 1987 in the farming and mining town of Welverdien, around 40 miles southwest of the city of Johannesburg in South Africa. He was raised predominantly by his maternal grandparents, with his mother spending long periods of time away, working in the city. Years later, during court proceedings, a probation report would give details about the child that Ferreira was, with it stating, quote, his mother indicated that he was an aggressive child who would damage his grandparents' property and belongings. Throughout his life, Ferreira would have a chip on his shoulder regarding his mother, claiming that the pair had a poor relationship because she would spend time away when he was younger, meaning that he felt abandoned. However, when the pair were around each other, Ferreira would demand money, and when he didn't get this, he would beat up his mother. Both parties later confirmed this to professionals, with Ferreira's mother saying that she didn't want to give her son any money because he was spending it on drugs, specifically crystal meth, which he began using when he was still a teenager, and which he quickly became addicted to. Hugo Ferreira made no attempts to hide the assaults against his mother. A cousin later reported that she'd seen him knocking his mother to the floor and dragging her along the cement floor by the hair. In around 2017, when he was 30 years old, Ferreira got married, but he later claimed that 4 years later, his wife had an affair. In response, he smashed up the home he and his wife shared, including destroying the furniture, ripping out electrical cables, and eventually setting fire to the property. Ferreira's wife went to the police and got a protective order, but he violated this again and again and again, and was arrested on multiple occasions. These were not his only brushes with the law. Police later confirmed that Ferreira had convictions for theft, malicious damage to property, use of counterfeit money, and assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. There are a few more pieces of information here and there, and they all portray Hugo Ferreira as a self-absorbed, violent piece of shit. A man who had a particular hatred of women, as well as being a classic domestic abuser, constantly paranoid his partners were cheating on him. He was a man, and I use that term loosely, who thought nothing of battering women in his life if they defied him. And as we'll get to, age was not a barrier to the harm he would cause, as he would go on to murder his own daughter, who was barely a week old. Sometime after his first wife had escaped and divorced him, Ferreira met a woman called Maureen Brand. There is no specific information about what their relationship was like, but I imagine it was hell on earth for Maureen. But eventually they got married, and in 2023, the pair were living in the small town of Welverdien. On the 31st of May 2023, Maureen gave birth to their first child, who they named Caithlyn. This should have been a happy moment for the couple. Their family was now complete. But Hugo Ferreira is a man without empathy, without conscience. He is the embodiment of pure evil. And just 8 days later, this violent psychopath would sexually assault and murder his own daughter. On Thursday the 8th of June 2023, Hugo Ferreira was at home with his wife Maureen Brand and their newborn daughter, Caithlyn, who was just 8 days old. It's clear the family were in dire financial straits, as on this day, Maureen left to go and sell clothes in order to buy food for Caithlyn. However, despite not having money to get food for the baby, Ferreira had enough to buy himself crystal meth, and he was using this on the day. The utter selfishness of this man just pervades this case. Ferreira told Maureen to come back within 5 minutes. The reason for this appears, from later reports, to have been due to his pathological jealousy. He was convinced that his wife was having an affair with her ex-boyfriend. Also, I think that he set this timescale as he knew his wife would fail to get back in time, and he could use this as an excuse to beat her. Ferreira was filled with rage when Maureen didn't come back within a few minutes, and then Caithlyn began to cry because she was hungry and had a soiled nappy. But her demon of a father, instead of comforting his child, later told the court that he saw red, and decided to give his child, quote, something to cry about, with him later reporting that he used this little girl as a focus for all of his hatred towards not only Maureen, but also his mother, who was convinced had abandoned him as a child. During the later legal proceedings, Ferreira admitted attacking his daughter, but minimised the savagery of the attack. His plea statement said, quote, I grabbed the baby hard at the back of her neck and hit her repeatedly in the process, pushed her head against the surface on which I was working. Caithlyn's autopsy showed that she'd been mercilessly beaten, and there was evidence of torture. A puncture wound was found in her groin area, indicating that she'd been poked with a needle, and there was bruising around her neck, showing that she'd been strangled. Caithlyn suffered catastrophic injuries to her neck, face and skull, suggesting that she'd been beaten repeatedly, but also likely thrown against hard surfaces. So it seems that Ferreira threw his daughter against the walls and floor. These were injuries someone would sustain in a high-speed car crash, and this is what he did to a defenceless 8-day-old baby. But this wasn't the end of the horror in this case. Ferreira also forced his fingers inside his daughter's vagina and rubbed his penis against her genitals. Soon, Maureen returned, and this caused Ferreira to panic. He later admitted, quote, when her mother returned, I realised she would see that something was wrong. Kept the baby away from her until later that day. Did this because I realised the baby was seriously injured. Maureen eventually had to call the police simply to try and gain access to her child, and when they arrived, they arrested Hugo Ferreira. Caithlyn was rushed to hospital, but her injuries were unsurvivable, and she died the next day. When she passed away, Ferreira was rearrested for murder and eventually charged with this offence. It appears that from early on, he admitted his offending, and he confirmed that he'd also sexually assaulted his own daughter, so this was added to the charges, with his claims being backed up by the results of the autopsy. He was remanded to prison to await his fate. From the minute that he was arrested, Hugo Ferreira's cold demeanour and complete lack of empathy was noted. He showed no emotion about the fact that he'd sexually assaulted and killed his own child. As if this man couldn't be any more evil, in court he continued to show no empathy and said that he wanted to commit another murder. In March 2025, at Pretoria High Court, Hugo Ferreira pleaded guilty to the murder and rape of his 8-day-old daughter Caithlyn. He admitted to this via a plea statement, which I believe was read out by his legal representative. Within this, as I already outlined, he admitted that he'd hit his daughter, but her injuries showed signs of torture and far worse violence than he would admit. He also admitted the sexual element to his behaviour. Ferreira acknowledged that he was high on crystal meth during the attack, but stated this had little impact on his decision making with his statement also saying, quote, "I accept that it was a cruel and gruesome attack, especially on such a young baby. The action was clearly illegal, and I did it with intent." Reports were completed on Ferreira, including a psychiatric assessment and also a pre-sentence report completed by a probation officer. The findings of the former report I'll come back to in a moment. But with regards to the probation report, Ferreira was nonchalant during his interview, apparently indifferent to his crimes. This appeared in large part due to the fact he blamed Caithlyn's mother, Maureen Brand, for his actions. He had killed his daughter, according to him, because of anger towards her. By this point, Maureen had divorced Ferreira, and he casually told the officer that interviewed him that if he wasn't kept in prison, he would kill her. So not only had he killed his daughter and inevitably shattered Maureen's world, he wanted to also take her life. During this interview, he also moaned about being abandoned by his mother and Maureen. He was apparently the victim in all of this. Hugo Ferreira's threats about killing Maureen if he wasn't kept in prison were baseless. He was going to stay there for decades. It was just a case of for how long. Ferreira was back in court for sentencing on Friday the 4th of April 2025 before Judge Portia Fallain. He was guaranteed a life sentence for his crimes, but decided to argue for a lesser time in prison before he could apply for parole. His rationale was that he should get credit for pleading guilty, as this had meant that the court's time was not wasted by having to conduct a lengthy trial, and his plea, according to him, showed remorse for his actions. The prosecution argued against the pathetic statements of the defence. They pointed out that the victim in this case was an 8-day-old child, this monster's daughter. He had utterly betrayed her trust by the things he'd done to her. This was, in their opinion, one of the most evil acts that had ever come before the court. As part of the sentencing exercise, the judge outlined all of the injuries that Caithlyn had suffered, and it was during this that the findings of the psychiatrist were revealed, as well as the utter callousness of Hugo Ferreira being on full display. As one journalist wrote, quote, "As Judge Fallain recited the litany of injuries inflicted upon the helpless newborn, Ferreira stood impassive, his expression blank, his eyes devoid of any flicker of humanity. His attachment was so absolute that it bordered on indifference, reinforcing the psychiatric evaluation that diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, a condition marked by a chilling absence of empathy." Judge Fallain destroyed Ferreira. She utterly rejected his pleas for leniency. She stated that his crimes were not due to a, quote, "sudden rage, but a premeditated act of unfathomable cruelty." She also said that his anger towards Caithlyn's mother and his own warped sense of rejection didn't excuse, nor even explain, the calculated brutality he inflicted on an utterly defenceless infant. She stated that the case against Ferreira was overwhelming, and his guilty pleas were not a sign of genuine remorse, but a tactical move to gain a lesser sentence. She then sentenced him. For the rape and murder of his 8-day-old daughter Caithlyn Ferreira, 37-year-old Hugo Ferreira was given 2 life sentences. From the articles I've read, I believe these were ordered to run consecutively, meaning that he will never be released from prison. Ferreira showed absolutely no emotion when the sentence was passed, and after exchanging a few brief words with his barrister, he was taken back to prison to spend the rest of his life behind bars. If you've made it this far, I can imagine you're filled with the same level of disgust and shock that I was when I first heard about this case. My anger at this piece of shit only grew as I learned more about every horrific detail of the death of 8-day-old Caithlyn Ferreira at the hands of her so-called father. This is the youngest victim I've covered on this channel, and it's almost incomprehensible to believe that anyone could harm a baby this young, let alone do the things that Hugo Ferreira did to her. He's a special type of evil. We don't know much about Ferreira's background, but he seems to have been the perpetual victim. He had a chip on his shoulder about his mother abandoning him. Maybe this is true, but I think that Ferreira is a man who struggles to tell the truth, and all of his statements are tainted by his own desire to get attention from everyone. So they'll pat him on the head and say, "Oh, poor little man, it's understandable why you did these things. It's all everyone else's fault." Likely, his mother had to travel into Johannesburg to earn money to raise her son. She was probably a hard-working woman. But let's say I'm wrong. Let's say his mother was a terrible parent. Does that excuse what he did? No. He can fuck off with that shit. I imagine he considered they had a poor relationship because his mother didn't give him everything he wanted. This raises something that's central to Hugo Ferreira's personality. His narcissism, his sense of entitlement. He got what he wanted, otherwise he would hurt people. I noticed something about all of the pictures I can find of Ferreira, aside from the ones in court. They're all taken by him, and he's clearly trying to pose and look tough and buff. I do think that someone taking pictures repeatedly of themselves says a lot about them. A desperate need for approval, a focus solely on physical appearance. I imagine he had to take photos of himself because no one wanted to be around this vicious, pathetic bastard. But his attempts to look tough hid how utterly weak and pathetic he was. He was another sad domestic abuser who couldn't handle women having any agency in their relationship. He was someone who was sure women would abandon him, so he controlled them. He was pathologically jealous, and I imagine he would interrogate his partners about alleged affairs and would beat them when they denied any wrongdoing. When they got sick and tired and eventually escaped, it was poor little Hugo. They left him. They were all bitches. This no doubt added to his hatred of women. We don't know much about Ferreira's marriage to Maureen Brand, but I think we can make some solid assumptions. I have no doubt she was under his control and was the victim of violence. He only thought about himself. This was like the reason why Maureen had to go out and sell clothes to get food for their baby, whilst he had money to spend on Crystal. He didn't see her leaving the house as her trying to look out for their baby. In his twisted mind, she was going to cheat on him. He couldn't conceive of the fact that anyone would actually put their baby first. Of course, her primary concern was having sex with other men. Ferreira gave Maureen 5 minutes to get back, to ensure that she wouldn't have time to be unfaithful. But as I said earlier, I think he gave this timescale so that she would fail to return on time, and he would have an excuse to beat her. He was already annoyed, consumed with his feelings of paranoia, high on Crystal, and then Caithlyn started crying. She was a thing to him, not his daughter, not a little person, merely an object, likely something he thought was useful to control his wife. What he did to his daughter, I think he did for several reasons. Firstly, to punish Caithlyn for daring to ask for something, daring to ask for comfort, daring to ask for a nappy to be changed. Ferreira was an individual who took. He didn't give anything. Secondly, to punish Maureen, to punish her for the fact that he'd convinced himself she was cheating on him. He murdered the person she loved the most in the world. Thirdly, to live out his hatred of women. Caithlyn was a little girl, so he instantly despised her, and him assaulting her was not only his way of punishing her simply because she happened to be born female, but he also used her tiny body to take out his hatred of Maureen and his mother. The sexual assault again, I think this had its own set of reasons. This includes punishment. I think that in Ferreira's mind, sexual violence was how he punished women. With no doubt that he used this against his former partners when they annoyed him. Secondly, it was part of his sadistic behaviour, causing Caithlyn as much pain as possible, getting off on her screams, her distress, getting a rush from the power. Ferreira felt no remorse for his actions, but this is because he's a psychopath. The psychiatrist assessed him as having antisocial personality disorder, and a psychopath is generally considered to be someone who has extreme traits of this condition. Whilst it doesn't say anywhere whether the psychiatrist thought that Ferreira met this threshold, I have no doubt that he does. His vacant demeanour is chilling. There's nothing behind his cold eyes. He also took no responsibility for his actions. Ferreira said that he wanted to kill Maureen. Why? Because she was the reason for him being in this situation. In his disturbed mind, he likely thought that had she complied, had she not gone out or returned within 5 minutes, he wouldn't have attacked their daughter. It was all her fault. If he could, he would have killed her, punishing her for the situation he created. I mean, this man is so fucked up in the head, it's terrifying. Luckily, he'll never walk the streets again. I assume worldwide, child killers have a target on their back in prison, and I hope that one day Hugo Ferreira suffers even a fraction of the horror he put his daughter through. And then, when he's dead, he can rest in peace. So what are your thoughts on this case? If you like the content, then consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button. You can also send a one-off donation to support the channel using the thanks button. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.